So let's start with a few minutes to settle down physically, mentally, in the present moment. So you can take a few deep breaths, breathing in slowly, deeply, and then let the air go out slowly. Imagine if there's any tension in your body or mind that goes out with the exhalation of the breath. And just breathe normally. Let your mind settle down in the present. So if there are thoughts in your mind left over from what you were doing earlier today or any time in the past, let go of those thoughts, put them aside. And also let go of thoughts of the future, plans for what you're going to do later today, tonight, tomorrow, and so on. So these are just thoughts in our mind. They're not solid and permanent things. They're clouds, like clouds going through the sky. So just let them go. You can always pick them up again later, but really try to decide to keep your mind on the present, in the present moment, and doing what we are doing here. And also have a positive altruistic motivation for being part of this class. Buddha's teachings are all about compassion, how to generate compassion and love for others, and how to help others, which is what you're doing in your life anyway. Let's see if you can feel the wish to learn something in this class that will be helpful to you, to be more helpful to others. So I hope everyone had a nice weekend, doing well in your health, in your work, and so on. So we'll continue looking at afflictive emotions. Last time we looked at anger, and today I thought to move on to the next one, which is attachment, or desirous attachment is another translation for this. First, before we move on, do any of you have any questions about the material we went through about anger?
I wanted to ask you about something I don't remember in which class of the last classes you were talking about, the differentiation between worldly feelings and or emotions and the spiritual ones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
And the question is, I understand in the worldly emotions there is an object which promotes a feeling of more or less or neutral, okay? And about the spiritual one, does they have an object too?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so that's actually in the Wednesday class. When we're going through the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So in with regard to the second of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, that's mindfulness of feelings. So we've been looking at that and different kinds of feelings, worldly and spiritual. Um, so actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on Wednesday, which actually recorded already yesterday, and also a little give you a little exercise so you can try to recognize these different kinds of feelings in your own experience. But yeah, so this is talking about feelings, which is not the same as emotions. It's more basic. It's a more like the first initial reaction that we have when we encounter an object. So with some objects, we have a pleasant feeling. With other objects, we have an unpleasant feeling. And with others, we have a neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So that applies both to spiritual and worldly feelings. There's always an object. Every time we have an experience, any kind of experience, according to my understanding, there's always an object that's there as our object, the object of the mind. And then we're feeling either pleasant or unpleasant or neutral about it. So that's true with spiritual feelings. That was your question. So even with spiritual feelings, so some obvious examples of that would be if you're doing a meditation on death. That's one of the very important meditations in Buddhism. But so the object would be death, and then contemplating death, how, yeah, I'm going to die one day and everybody has to die one day. So the object would be death. And probably most people would have an unpleasant feeling when they think about death or they hear about death. Um, but yeah, maybe not everyone feels that way. Some may have a neutral feeling. But yeah, so there's always an object. So even in the case of spiritual feelings, which are usually, for example, when we're meditating, we're contemplating on some aspect of the Buddha's teachings, such as death, impermanence, suffering. Those are objects that we don't usually feel joyful about. So there could be unpleasant feelings coming up in our mind when we think about that. Oh, I'm going to die one day, and there's suffering in my life, there's suffering in the world. So those kind of objects of meditation, objects of contemplation, often give rise to unpleasant feelings. And then we can have pleasant feelings when we're doing meditation. For example, when we meditate on loving kindness, compassion, joy, um, or how others have been so kind to us, helpful to us, and so on. So those are objects that we might feel joyful about, have a pleasant feeling about, or thinking about the Buddha, or thinking about our spiritual teachers. So that doing those contemplations probably gives rise to a pleasant feeling. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yes, but so what is the point in differentiating between them?
Well, I haven't really come across an explanation of that, but I can just make a guess. Because in the case of worldly feelings, they usually lead to afflictions, and they're usually already based on afflictions. So, for example, when we have a worldly feeling, we're eating delicious food or hearing music that we like. If we have a pleasant feeling, then that probably increases our attachment, increases our desire, our attachment, our greed. And then when we have an unpleasant worldly feeling, when there's some unpleasant sound or unpleasant smell or unpleasant taste, and we have an unpleasant feeling, that usually increases our aversion, which is a kind of anger or hatred. So again, that's an afflictive state of mind that gets increased when we have worldly feelings. On the other hand, so on the other hand, when we have spiritual feelings, unworldly feelings, if we're doing our meditation correctly, if we're, contemplating correctly, the unworldly feelings will lead to positive states of mind, such as renunciation. I want to get out of samsara. I want to free myself from this situation I'm in of samsara, and attain liberation and attain enlightenment. And so unworldly feelings, spiritual feelings, they lead to positive states of mind and help us in our practice to progress along the path. So I think it's just to become aware that there are different kinds of feelings that arise towards different kinds of objects. And some of those feelings might keep us further embedded in samsara, in suffering, whereas other feelings, even if they might be unpleasant feelings, like in the case of contemplating death, it's an unpleasant feeling. However, we shouldn't withdraw from that and say, oh, I don't want to have that feeling, so I'm not going to think about death anymore. Instead, we have to understand that that kind of unpleasant feeling is one that will help us further our spiritual practice. So that's just what I can think of from the top of my head. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I will ask you another question. Sorry for the interruption in our class, but the other class is recorded. So
this one is recorded too. It's being recorded. But you have to ask Eleanor how to get access to it.
No, it's pre-recorded, so I cannot ask the question.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
You mean, yeah. Okay.
So I'm asking because we psychologists do a lot with feelings, like
yeah.
And I'm thinking about differentiating between the feelings which are more samsaric, which are related to the three kleshas, right? Which I maybe need to recognize them and then let them go, fade away, not pay too much attention in the therapy, in the session, and instead
your own feelings, the feelings that are arising in your own mind
in my own mind and in the patient's mind that he's talking about.
Yeah.
Letting them, recognizing them, and then letting them not interpret them too much, maybe, and in contrast to the spiritual ones, which might not be pleasant, like thinking about death, about things are changing, aging, which are worthwhile going on further, or something like that.
Yeah. I was just thinking, though, as you were talking, that even with regard to the worldly feelings, I mean, we can't really help but have those just arise so quickly, so spontaneously. We can't really stop them. And in themselves, they're not bad. We have a pleasant feeling. I mean, even the Buddha, it says, even the Buddha would have a pleasant feeling when he's eating some delicious food. So, but the difference in the Buddha is it doesn't give rise to attachment, because Buddha is free of attachment and lust and greed. So those kind of kleshas wouldn't arise in his mind. He just has a pleasant feeling and then lets it go. And so if we do have pleasant feelings or unpleasant feelings, and we're practicing mindfulness, and we have an understanding of impermanence, I mean, that's one thing we need to understand, is that all these feelings are impermanent. They just last a short time and then they disappear. And so we don't need to get so caught up in them and take them so seriously and, worry about them and so on and so forth. So just understanding their impermanence can help us to notice them and then let them go, because a pleasant feeling arises, but then it changes, it goes away, and then an unpleasant feeling arises, and then that one changes and goes away. So understanding how they are just momentary and permanent, they come and they go, um, helps us not identify with them and be able to let them go. But then, what you were talking about with your patients in therapy, I don't know, I have not much knowledge and experience of that, but you mentioned interpreting. So, yeah, that's part of your work is interpreting. But then I guess what I was talking about, what Buddhism is talking about, is more to do with your own spiritual practice. Yeah. So if we are working on our own spiritual practice, we are aspiring to free ourselves from suffering and the causes of suffering and attain liberation and enlightenment. So, in that context, this is how we deal with feelings. We try to just observe them, not identify with them, understand they are impermanent, let them go, and so on and so forth. But you're talking about a different situation. Your work as therapists, dealing with your patients. And so part of your work, I guess, is to look at the feelings of the patient, the feelings and the emotions of your patient, and try to understand them to be able to help them. So in that case, I think it's still helpful to understand that feelings are impermanent, they don't last. And also that there's the possibility that feelings can lead to afflictive emotions like attachment and anger and so forth. But you may need to do some analysis. That's part of your work, psychoanalysis, to do analysis of those feelings and try to understand, why does the person feel this way? And how can I help them? And so on. So this is a different context. Yeah, the context of being a therapist and working with your patients, the way in which you look at feelings and work with feelings would be different than in the context of spiritual practice, working on your own spiritual development. That's just what I'm thinking as you ask this question. Does that make sense? So it's like two different contexts. One context is your spiritual practice, your spiritual development, and the other context is helping your patients. So the way in which you deal with feelings, um, would be different. There would be some differences in those two different contexts. Does that make sense?
I'm trying to do all the instructions of the antidotes of personal work that you were instructing uh, with the patient. Like if I'm not trying to theorize or trying to understand why does he has this feeling, because some of it is his biography, some of it is karmatic that we cannot reach, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm trying uh, to label the feeling like there is a lot of pain and not say you are in pain, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I try to anyway to relax the body and the mind in order to be able to hold the pain, right, and not go away from it. And I'm trying to and all of these I'm doing with the worldly, especially with the worldly ones, but in with the spiritual ones, it's a bit different. Like I need to add something which is the concept of karma, right? To hold them. To I'm trying to understand what.
Are you talking about spiritual feelings in your patient's mind or your own spiritual feeling?
Yeah. If the patient is talking about his pain because of the change of the age, he's aging, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so how can I help him with that? Okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, I mean, we as Buddhists, those of us who are practicing, the Buddha advised us to contemplate aging. And, even when we're 20 years old or 60 years old, just to contemplate the fact that our body is aging. And as we get older, we're going to have more and more physical problems and so on and so forth. So to prepare ourselves for those experiences that are going to come rather than think, I'm going to be like this forever. My body will never change. And so we deliberately think about aging, suffering of aging, even before it comes, even before it happens, to prepare ourselves for it and to help ourselves overcome our attachment, our desire for samsaric existence, so that we do what we have to do to get free, to get liberated. But in the case of your patient, that person may not be thinking in the same way. You know, if they don't have this Buddhist idea that we have to contemplate aging, but they're experiencing it, they're experiencing aging. So I'm not really sure what would be appropriate to say to your patient, except maybe just, well, aging is something that happens to everybody. It's just a natural part of life. All human beings have to go through that experience. And so it's just something that we need to accept and acknowledge. I mean, if the person is not open to the Buddhist idea of samsara and rebirth and so on and so forth, then it wouldn't be appropriate to talk to them in those ways. So maybe you just have to find a way of talking to the person that would make sense to them and would be helpful for them to accept the suffering that they are going through. Maybe compassion, help them understand that other people have this suffering as well. You're not the only one. And you can actually use the suffering you are going through to understand the suffering of others and have more empathy for them and more compassion for them and also help them. So you might try to talk to them in that way, and they might be able to accept that and make sense of that and have find that useful. I don't know, it really depends on the patient's mind and what's acceptable to them, what's useful to them, and if that's even appropriate.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's good that you're asking these questions, because where I'm coming from is really the Buddhist view, which is, oh, how we use these practices and these ideas for our own practice to work on our own mind. But I hadn't thought about how you bring these into your practice with your patients. I don't have that experience myself, so I wouldn't know how to do that. But you can be creative. It sounds like you are already doing that,
No, I
bringing some
think
of
you
this.
helped me anyway. I think if we, as the patient, the analyst, hold these views, okay, it
Yeah,
really helps when we come, when
I
we
think
want.
I'm sure, because, for example, if an analyst, a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, is afraid of death, for example, has aversion for death and fear of death, and they don't know how to deal with death, if that is their own experience, then if they're dealing with a patient who has those feelings, who is afraid of death, how can the analyst help that patient? They haven't even dealt with that themselves. And so I think, yeah, if we use these practices from Buddhism to learn how to manage our own fears and our aversions and so on about these different experiences in life, such as aging and death and so forth, then we're in a better position to be able to help others who are going through those experiences. Yeah. Thank you for asking those questions. Okay, so are we ready to talk a little bit about attachment? So I hope you did the reading, and then I don't need to read every part of the book. So there's a description of attachment. So it's what arises towards an object that we find attractive. So initially, we'll have a pleasant feeling if we're attentive to our feelings and we notice that we have a pleasant feeling towards a certain object, then it's possible that in the next moment there will be attachment, or several moments later. May take a while, but attachment usually arises after we have a pleasant feeling for the object. And what happens in our mind is we see an object that we find pleasant, attractive, and then the mind tends to, this isn't something we do deliberately, I think it's just an automatic process. The mind tends to exaggerate the pleasantness of the object and, kind of paint a picture of it. Oh, wow, that's so wonderful. That's so fantastic. And we might even see it as perfect, flawless, just what I've always wanted. This is going to bring me happiness forever and ever and ever. So this is something that can happen really, really fast, and even we're not fully aware of it. But before we know it, there's this feeling, I want that object. We have desire, we have attachment for that object. I want it. So if it's a material object we see in a supermarket or the department store or on television or whatever, then we can find ourselves running to buy it, to get it. And if it's a person we find really, really attractive, then, we might start having lust for that person, wanting to have sex with that person, having all these fantasies, romantic fantasies, sexual fantasies about that person, and then, trying to find a way of getting close to them, being able to fulfill our desires. So attachment can arise towards all kinds of objects, not just material things or people, but also more abstract things such as information, knowledge, travel experiences. We see an advertisement for the Bahamas or the Maldives, I don't know what they're called. Beautiful islands, surrounded by turquoise blue sea and white sands. And yeah, anyway, so travel advertisements make these places look really attractive. And then we want to go there and have, that experience of being in that place. So, yeah. And also, even in meditation, we hear about meditative experiences, feeling blissful, single pointed concentration, and so on. And we could have attachment for those as well. I want to have that experience. Now, of course, it's good to have meditative experiences, but not with attachment. So, attachment can actually mess up our mind, mess up our meditation, and damage our practice. So it's a tricky thing, to have. We need to have the wish to have pleasant, to have meditative experiences, but not with attachment. And in fact, there was a description. I think it's in here. Yeah, a few paragraphs down in the book, it mentions aspiration. So aspiration is another mental factor. that is not negative. It's not a klesha. It's not an affliction. It's actually kind of a neutral mental factor, neither good nor bad. And so that's the word we would use when it comes to wanting to attain liberation, wanting to attain enlightenment, wanting to benefit other sentient beings, wanting to attain meditative experiences like calm abiding and wisdom and so forth. So we don't use the word attachment for those kind of wishes, but rather aspiration. Okay, so there is a difference between attachment and aspiration. Attachment usually is exaggerated. It has an exaggerated view of the object. And also there's probably a certain amount of ego involved, a strong sense of I and self-centeredness. I want to have that object. I want to have that experience just for myself, just for my own pleasure. So that's usually what lies behind attachment. Whereas aspiration, like in the spiritual practice, our aspiration is more than just I, but it's I want to help others, I want to help the world, I want to do good, I want to stop suffering, I want to bring happiness. So it's more than just about me, this, narrow, self-centered attitude, but it's bigger than that, it's broader than that, more wholesome. So, okay, so let's look at the antidotes. You'll do a meditation on Wednesday, a meditation on attachment and some of the antidotes to it. So I'll just talk a little bit about the antidotes now. So the first one on the list of antidotes is to contemplate the faults of attachment, because it's not so obvious as with anger. I think with anger and hatred, it's easier to see how that state of mind is problematic. But attachment, we might think, well, what's wrong with attachment? What's bad about attachment? It makes me feel good and it keeps me closer to people, friendships, love. Well, that's one thing. We have to recognize the difference between attachment and love, because many people see them as the same thing. So you probably heard this before, but it doesn't hurt to mention it again. The main difference between attachment and love is attachment is more about me. It's more self-centered. I want to feel good. I want happiness. I want the good things that come from this relationship. So we're focused more on ourself rather than the other person. Whereas love, genuine love or loving kindness, metta, that's more focused on the other person. I want them to be happy. I want to do what's good for them. Okay, so it's the self, the I is not so prominent. It might be there a little bit, but the main focus is on the other and helping the other. So the I is not so important in the relationship. So that's the main way to tell the difference between love and attachment. And sometimes it's difficult to know if our feelings are love or attachment. They're probably kind of mingled, mixed up. But one way we can differentiate them is if the other person doesn't do what we want them to do, or if they do what we don't want them to do, and then we get angry at them. It's like our love turns into anger, maybe even hatred, maybe even the wish to harm them. So that shows that there was attachment and not love. I don't think love, genuine love, pure love, would never turn into hatred, would never turn into the wish to harm the other person. So if we do have hatred and the wish to harm, then that's coming from attachment, because it's like, I wanted you to make me happy. I wanted you to do what I want you to do. And if you don't do that, then I'm going to be angry at you. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to leave you. Okay, so when those kind of things happen, that's the result of attachment rather than love. So it's good to watch our mind, watch our experience, and try to differentiate those two states of mind, which can look quite similar, but they are not the same. And then ideally, we try to have more love, unconditional, genuine love for the other person and less attachment. And so, yeah, it's good to recognize the faults of attachment, how it leads to problems, especially in relationships, because it's attachment that leads us to have expectations, having expectations of other people that they should do what we want them to do, they should behave in this way, and they shouldn't behave in that way, and so on. So we kind of put these expectations on other people. And that comes from attachment and not from love. And so I think when there's problems in relationships, when any kind of problem comes up in a relationship, it's due to attachment. So it's always helpful when we do have a problem in a relationship to look at our mind and ask ourselves, okay, why did this happen? What did I expect? What were my expectations of this person and this relationship? Were my expectations fair, just, realistic? Um, yeah. Also, attachment disturbs our mind. It makes our mind unpeaceful and disturbed. We've probably all had the experience of getting really excited about wanting something and then just being almost crazy, almost like, yeah, crazy, just frantically trying to get that object and even reckless about how we behave and even knocking people over. Like people sometimes have stampedes, stampedes, like cattle. This happened recently here in America. There was some concert in Texas and a music concert, and people were just so frantic to get to the front of the auditorium or the hall to be right in front of the stage and as close to the singers as possible. So they were just pushing each other over, and several people were killed and injured and so forth. So that's a very sad, tragic example of what can happen with attachment. We have such strong attachment that we don't take care of how we behave, and we can even do things that cause harm or death to others. So that kind of thing can happen. There's something like that in Israel. Wasn't it last year? There was a kind of stampede. Although I don't think it was, I don't know if it was related to attachment, but I think, yeah, just the circumstances of the place. They were religious people, and there was a something that was blocked, a door was blocked, and then people didn't know it was blocked, and they kept pushing and pushing. So that may not have been because of attachment, but because of other things. So how do we deal with attachment? So I'll just kind of, yeah, I mean, maybe probably many of the people in that crowd were acting out of attachment. Maybe it was just the causes and conditions leading to that situation, and they just got caught up in the whole that situation. And yeah, it may not have been attachment or anger or any afflictions, but just the situation, the circumstances. Very tragic, anyway. So when we do notice, anyway, the point here is to look at our own mind and recognize our own attachment and work on that. And if we can see that attachment leads to problems and suffering, I mean, in the Buddhist path, attachment is one of the main things that keeps us in samsara. Um, so when the Buddha gave his very first teaching, and he was talking about suffering and then the causes of suffering, he mentioned craving. He said craving is the cause of suffering. It's not the only cause. There's also ignorance and anger and hatred, but craving, which is a kind of attachment, is one of the main causes that keeps us stuck in samsara, taking rebirth again and again and again. So, so someone who wants to attain nirvana, liberation, enlightenment, they do need to overcome craving, attachment. So impermanence is a very helpful antidote, because when we have attachment, we have this sort of wishful thinking. We want the object of our attachment to always be there and to not change, to not go away. We don't want to be separated from the object of attachment. So contemplating impermanence, which is kind of obvious if we think about it, we think about how things that just by nature, they change, they don't last, they're not going to be there forever. We're not going to be here forever. So the more we contemplate impermanence and get used to impermanence, then we realize that attachment just doesn't make sense. It's unrealistic. It's asking for the impossible. So that helps us. We can't immediately get rid of our attachment just like that. It's something gradual because it's so deeply embedded. So we're so habituated to attachment. So we can't just immediately get rid of it. But gradually we can decrease it. And this is one of the most helpful ways to do that, is by just realizing that attachment is unrealistic. It's wanting things to be permanent forever, and that is just impossible. It's like in the love songs, the romantic songs and music, movies, and so on. There's often talk about, I will love you forever. We will be together forever. We will live happily ever after. So, yeah, I mean, if we think about it, that is just not possible. That's like a fairy tale. And then the other aspect of impermanence is death. So not only are things changing moment by moment, people, human beings and other beings, are subject to death. We will not live forever. We are all going to die one day. This is something people don't want to think about, but Buddhism says it's very important for us to think about it so that we're prepared for it when it happens. And it doesn't have to be a painful, unpleasant experience. It can be a peaceful experience, even a joyful experience, depending on our mind, depending on how we work with our mind. So that also helps us to let go of our attachment. So then number 4 on the list says, attachment tends to exaggerate the good qualities of an object, so it can be useful to deliberately bring to mind unpleasant or negative aspects of the object. So the things we get attached to are usually imperfect things. Even though we like them to be perfect, we might imagine them to be perfect, but they probably aren't. They probably do have imperfections and faults and aspects that are not so wonderful, not so great. And so when we have attachment, part of attachment is to, have wishful thinking and fantasized thinking and kind of imagine the object to be 100% wonderful and perfect and fantastic and able to satisfy my every desire. But it's probably not like that. It's probably not 100% perfect. It does have faults, it does have imperfections. And so, if we recognize that we have attachment and we are exaggerating and fantasizing, and we want to decrease that, then we can bring to mind aspects of the object that are not imperfect. So, for example, I give an example here. If I had a BMW, I would be so happy. Well, is that really true? Yeah, there would be some pleasure having a BMW and driving around in that nice car. But then on the other hand, it's very expensive. And every time, it needs to be repaired, then it's very expensive. And then a lot of worries about it because other people would like to have your BMW as well. And they may just decide to take it, steal it. So then you have the suffering of having your car stolen and so on and so forth, or damaged. Yeah, if you get into a little crash, or if you just leave your car in the parking lot and then you come out afterwards and you find a big scratch along the side of your car, then that will be terrible suffering because you don't want that scratch there. You want your car to be perfect. So anyway, there's problems. There's difficulties and problems that come from having a wonderful car, or even if it's not such a wonderful car, any kind of car we have, there's going to be problems. So it's just good to remind ourselves of that and understand that it's, the experience will not be 100% wonderful and fantastic. And the same with people. If we find ourselves attracted to another person, we might notice our mind fantasizing, oh, how wonderful it would be if I could have a relationship with that person. It would be just like heaven, perfect from start to finish. Maybe it will never finish, it will go on forever. So if we see our mind having those kinds of thoughts and fantasies, we can recognize that it's unrealistic. We've all had relationships before, and maybe in the beginning it was wonderful, it was like heaven, but then later it may have turned into hell. Sometimes heaven becomes hell. The person is still there, you're still there, but the relationship changes and it becomes painful and suffering rather than wonderful and blissful. And so it's just helpful to remind ourselves of that, to cool down our attachment, to bring down that mind that is so full of fantasies and expectations that are unrealistic. Just bring ourselves down to earth. But in doing this, the point is not to go to the other extreme and develop aversion for the object. We do have to be careful about that. Some meditators have that experience when they contemplate, like the faults and the suffering nature of samsara, then they can end up feeling aversion, feeling hatred. And that isn't good. That's just another affliction. So we don't want to go that far and have feelings of aversion, hatred. So instead, we want to stay somewhere in the middle, a balanced view, a middle way where we can see the faults of people and objects, but we also see their good qualities. We don't want to, ignore and deny the good qualities of people because we want to have love and compassion for them, not aversion. So we have to watch our mind and watch what's happening in our mind. And if our mind is starting to go in the direction of aversion, we have to pull ourselves back from that and remind ourselves, yes, people have good qualities and they're helpful for me, they're helpful for others, and so on and so forth. So find some way of restoring your positive feelings to others rather than aversion. So, is that clear what I'm saying? I'm kind of going really fast and talking about a lot of things. But do you have any questions or comments about these ideas?
I personally find it hard to do this fourth one, like thinking about someone that I'm attached to, and deliberately think about his faults. Like, what does it useful? For me, it's more useful to think he has good things, but they are empty. Like it's not his own for good. Like it will change, might change. I don't love him because of these things that he gives me, but I cannot imagine thinking about his faults in order to get rid of the attachment.
Yeah.
And another question too, with Michal, I continue. So how can we hold the attachment, not the attachment, but hold something lightly? Because we want to buy things and to be to be aware, to have a car, to eat a cookie.
Of relationships.
And how because I understand we have not to say it's all the world and we don't have to say it's awful, but in the middle way, you understand me, right?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. It's very pertinent and something we all struggle with. Because like here in the monastery, you know, we have given up a lot of things. We've given up sex and drugs and alcohol and music and movies, but we still have to eat. We can't stop eating. We have to eat. So then it's a question of, okay, how do we, you know, fulfill our need for eating food? And sometimes we have very nice food. People offer us cakes and cookies and chocolates and so on. So how to do that without attachment? It's challenging. It's very challenging. So one is to remember impermanence, just to remind ourselves, okay, I have pleasure eating this food, but it's not permanent. It's not going to last. It's not something ultimate. It's going to end after a few minutes. So just to remind ourselves of impermanence, and also thinking of the kindness of others, you know, how it's through the kindness of others that I have this object. And so that helps to tone down the ego, the I that wants to enjoy this pleasure just for myself. And that also with having a car or having nice clothes, you're not doing this just for yourself. You need your car so that you can do your work for your patients and your children, your family, and so on and so forth, rather than just, I want to enjoy the pleasure of driving this nice car. So think about how the car can be used to benefit others. And the same with wearing nice clothes. You're doing that so that you can give pleasure to others rather than wearing rags and looking all dirty and, you know, is to benefit others rather than just yourself. So those are some ways we can transform our
I think it's a little lie, because when I buy something to wear, I don't think that it will be for the benefit of the other. It's not what I
Don't
think.
speak for the other.
But I think that when I buy something to wear, and I tell to myself, it's just a sweater. It's not hold the world. It's not. I can hold it lightly. I can say, okay, I it's nice to have, but it's not all my pleasure.
It's
my
not
real
ultimate.
pleasure is really to help others.
Yeah.
Not lie.
Yeah.
I think that people are more enjoying to be connected and to do דברים מוכנים, practice, זהו, כאילו, so that's what really make us happy.
Yeah.
But the truth is that even a coat or something,
car.
a car that it can make us happy. It's the truth. But
Yeah.
know that it's not something eternal or something.
Yeah.
We know it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm just giving different ideas, different options for how to transform our ordinary experiences of using food and clothes and so on and so forth, how we can use these things, enjoy these things without increasing our attachment or perpetuating our attachment. So you can just experiment with different methods, different ideas, and find what works best for you. And yeah, so what works for one person may not work for somebody else. So you just have to play around with these different ideas to find ways of decreasing the attachment. That's the bottom line. Whatever works. Yeah, because it is also important to be honest. So.
No, maybe in the monastery it's a way of thinking that you are connected to it. When you wear something, it's for the benefit of the other. But I don't really think that we have a kind of reflection. Maybe my friend, but not me.
Yeah, so that's fine. If that one doesn't work for you, then something else.
I think it's important that the antidote will be something.
It has to be applicable. Yeah, it has to.
Exactly.
Okay. So thank you very much.